Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. So do you remember the first long, deliberate walk you took in Toronto?
I remember a walk where I realized I should walk in Toronto. And it was probably a month after I moved here in the year 2000. And I moved from Windsor, Ontario, border town with Detroit, Michigan. And it's like Detroit, it's a car town. And I was probably in a car every day of my life until I moved to Toronto, in one way or the other. And I moved here without a car, which was part of the liberty of moving here, you know, subways and streetcars and whatever. And friends lived in a house a couple neighborhoods over from the apartment I first found, and I did not have the internet at my apartment, and I did not have a computer when I moved here in 2000, and I did not have a job, and I needed
free of all baggage.
Yes, all baggage that annoys yet pays. And so to look for a job, I needed the internet and a computer. So I'd go to some friend's house and troll the job sites for a job. And around 1:20 a.m., I would say, okay, thank you, good night. And I would run to the subway stop, which was nearby, and take the subway 2 stops and a streetcar 1 stop. And I was at my apartment. And one night, I think we were just chatting, or maybe we were drinking a few beers. Anyway, suddenly it's like towards 2 a.m. and the subway had stopped. And I was like, oh no, how am I going to get home? And I was not yet, because I was unjobbed, I did not take cabs, and I decided to walk. And I walked home, and it took me, I think, 20 minutes. It was a 20-minute walk up a hill and over the way, and it was kind of diagonal. The transit route was a right angle, half square, whereas this was a diagonal, almost as the crow flies trip. And I got to my house, and I felt a little bit ashamed that I didn't know this proximity between our two places, and a little bit elated that, wow, this is awesome.
It's not that far after all.
No, and I realized at that moment that this when you know a place by a car, which is how I used to know places, cities, and when you take transit, you are disconnected a bit from the geography, and just that walk sort of it was like the tectonic plates below Toronto like shifted, and it was like, oh, I understand. And from then on, I started walking around Toronto.
And it's here in Toronto we sit, where my guest has been walking most every day ever since, I assume. My guest, by the way, is Shawn Micallef. The show is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I am Colin Marshall. Shawn has written a lot about Toronto. He's a columnist for the Toronto Star. He's a co-owner and senior editor at Spacing magazine. We heard from Dylan Reed earlier in this show. In an earlier episode of this show. He's also a senior editor there at Spacing. He's the author of several books, including I'd say best known for walkers of Toronto, Stroll, Psychogeographic walking tours of Toronto, and most recently, a book called The Trouble with Brunch. Now for the question every interview has asked you and will ask you since that book came out. What is the trouble with brunch?
The trouble with brunch is that it's a waste of time. Sure. As it's practiced now. The trouble with brunch is that it could be so much more. This is again a Windsor coming to Toronto story. There's a lot of Windsor in this book, and it's not actually a book about brunch.
It's in many ways an autobiography.
A little bit, which I didn't intend it to be. I wanted to write a book about class, because since I moved to Toronto, I've been thinking a lot about the sort of class shift. Growing up in Windsor, which is an automotive town, my mom worked at General Motors, sewing seats for Cadillacs, and my dad worked at Hiram Walker's, which makes Canadian Club whiskey. Now again cool with Mad Men, but it wasn't cool then. It kind of fell off the radar of the chattering classes, but I thought I was a middle-class person growing up in Windsor, and then I moved to Toronto, and I found this vast population of people that were like actual middle-class people, and I realized that my outlook on the world and the way I kind of approach culture and everything else was a little more working class. So class has always been this thing that's been kind of bouncing around my head, and it's really hard to talk about. I mean, nobody talks about it. It's like the elephant in the room. We think we're a classless society, and so we kind of dance around it. But it's always been lingering, and I think because I came from away. And as I started going to brunches all the time, because people would say
the invitations started coming all of a sudden. Was that the case?
They did. Yeah, you roll into a downtown cosmopolitan city, and inevitably people will say, "Hey, do you want to go to brunch on Sunday?" I'm like, "Yes, I'm here. This is why I moved to Toronto, right?" And so I went to brunches, and I realized quickly I did not like them because they sprawled over the whole kind of afternoon of a Sunday. And you didn't really know what time it was, and because it could be at brunch time. When is that? It's made up.
11 to 2. You're there. I don't know.
I've heard 10 to 4. Like it's
I just mean when one might be there, but that's the full window probably.
But it really makes things hard to plan. If you say I'm going to meet you for lunch, like you kind of know what you can do with the rest of your day. If someone says I'll meet you for brunch, it's like okay, I'm going to block out the day.
Yeah, and I'll be 3 mimosas into it at the end, and
Yeah, and the people I would go to brunch with, who are friends, we're all the same. We would go to a popular brunch place that people wrote about. Not yet on blogs at that point, but now on blogs and like the popular places, the trendy places. And there'd inevitably be a lineup, and there'd be inevitably more of us that can fit around one little table, and there were always small little tables. And so we'd be kind of like haphazardly jammed into 2 tables with our knees touching, and it was uncomfortable, and it took an hour to get there, and the server was an artist type who was hungover inevitably, and the whole experience I found unpleasant and overly expensive and took too much time, and the thing you wanted, which was this enjoyable time with your friends to get to kind of catch up and whatever, was a really small part of the entire experience. So brunch became this sort of ordeal on the one day I had off, or the weekend, which became very precious because the jobs many of us have in cities are or elsewhere. This could actually apply to farmers. But perhaps there's not as many brunch places near farmers, is that this precious leisure time that keeps getting constricted by, checking email all the time and working until midnight and like laying in bed, having to answer emails and always being on. The preciousness was cranked up, and yet we were giving it away to this thing that wasn't enjoyable. And it felt like it was sort of an allegory for, what's happening to the urban middle class who work, for lack of a better term, creative jobs, the creative class, to use Richard Florida's term, who I use a lot in the book. And a lot of people in cities in these conditions, work stuff they love doing, but they work contracts, they don't have benefits, they don't have pensions, they don't, the irregular hours, or they might have 3 different contracts that they're working at the same time, and those things smash into each other. So this kind of ideal of what it is to be a middle class person, which I think is an appealing thing, and I want to be a middle class person because the ideal comes with leisure time, and it comes with stability and like a foundation and this idea that you're going to be okay into the future. It seemed like the way it's being practiced now in cities is kind of ignoring that the foundations are eroding quickly underneath us. And brunch became this way to get into the conversation, like a very kind of cheeky, slightly offensive to many people, way to get into the conversation.
Provocative.
I've been writing publicly for 12 years here in Toronto, and I got my first death threat because of this book.
Unbelievable. death threat. How serious did this death threat seem on a scale of 1 to 10?
I think it was an anonymous blog, like a kind of Reddit style blog, and there were a few people who talked about, I would like to take this person aside and shoot them, but like I've gotten angry comments before, and I do not take this seriously. Like, there are people who actually get real death threats, but this is the first time I even got a comedic death threat, or at least that's how I hope I interpret it. There's no wood to knock around here.
Sure.
But anyway,
we're in a woodless environment.
But how ridiculous to get a death threat about brunch, you know? Like, I've written things that should offend people more about other subjects. But brunch is such a, that was what was interesting about it, is that, brunch is so much a part of our life, our identity, because lifestyle has become so much a part of our identity. And as I was writing this book, exploring class, and looking at Richard Florida's work, he wrote Rise of the Creative Class in 2002, and he's actually based here in Toronto, but he's an American from, I think he came from Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and he came here in, I think, 2007. So he does write a bit about Toronto, so there's some Toronto in his work, but he wrote this book in 2002, and he charted how people who work creative jobs, and he's very liberal about what a creative job is, from people who are lawyers to actual artists to web designers, and all things in between. People who have a little bit of agency over what they do, like choices about what they do, whereas if you don't have a creative job, you are told what to do. Anyway, so that's a kind of like a really black and white way of looking at it. And there's so many different kinds of jobs that workers in this class, in this subset of the middle class, don't have any way to identify with each other. But how they do identify with is the leisure that they live. Like, I am a knitter. I'm an ultimate frisbee player. I go to brunch. If you look at like dating profiles on OkCupid or whatever, people will say, love to brunch. And if you look at Twitter, brunching today, looking forward to Sunday brunch, and Instagrams and whatever. So, lifestyle pursuits have become a way of people identify. Whereas back in Windsor, working class town, everyone identified easily through the work people did. It's an automotive town. All the big three were there. There's only two of the big American auto companies left. Ford and Chrysler. GM is gone. My mom's plant has now been bulldozed. But everyone, and this is a generalization, but the majority of people who worked industrial jobs kind of connected through the work. We all worked sort of in the automotive industry or one of the subsidiaries.
We're all in this together.
Yeah, or if you grew up in Sydney, Nova Scotia, or Cape Breton, you identified either with the fishery or the mining. There's a big mining there, or if it's West Virginia, the mining, or that sort of thing. Whereas in these kind of in complex economic cities like Toronto or Los Angeles or New York or London or Montreal, the jobs we do are very highly individualistic, yet we're experiencing the same conditions of precariousness, and not knowing where the next contract's going to come from. So the work didn't give us a connection to people, but looking at Richard Florida's research, which was quite rigorous in his book, people connect to each other through lifestyle. And so I was thinking, the light bulb went off that maybe brunch, this annoying thing, and also a way to get a book about class, which would sound very boring. I'm going to write a book about class. I'm not going to read that. But if you say it's the trouble with brunch, so brunch was...
That's the hook.
Yeah, and it's so much of a lifestyle thing now that so many people identify with so closely and passionately, hence the death threats.
Yeah.
It was a really wonderful way in to a conversation about class, and hoping that I nudge people into like taking a look at how our middle classness is being lived out here in big cities, and maybe taking a more critical look at the foundations underneath us.
It's funny you mentioned Richard Florida. I interviewed him years ago on a radio show I did in Santa Barbara, the predecessor to this show, in fact. And he advised me I should move to Los Angeles. I was already thinking in that direction, but I certainly acted on that advice. And in Los Angeles, I haven't gone to many brunches, but it's certainly a town where you can. You could go to brunch every day, probably, and at a different place as well. And reading about, I was not bothered by your indictment of brunch in the book, but I did find the book rang true in the sense that you hear the word middle class bandied around a lot in the media. I mean, maybe more than any other class-related term in America. Middle class, ad nauseum. You know, what's become of the middle class? I'm for the middle class. Every politician, as you write, is pro-middle class because it's so vague. But for myself, if I think, what class am I? It's an interesting question because if you actually ran the balance sheets, I don't know if I'd have a middle-class amount of money. Maybe I'd be poor. Nah, I wouldn't be poor because I don't have a family. I'd be okay for one person. But at the same time, it's like, well, I'm taking transoceanic flights a lot, and I don't feel like I lack for anything. Sure, I don't have a car or a house. I don't want a car or a house. And this all confuses the question of what class we are. I mean, this is pretty common for people like us, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you bring up transatlantic flights. I don't have kids, but sometimes I joke. I mean, it sounds really depressing, but it's not, because I don't want them. But I say flights are my children, right? Like,
yeah, mine too.
I spend my money on going to England or wherever it is, and that's the thing of it. Like, the class is not about income. And sometimes we think it is, but that is a part of it, but a small part of it. People in Windsor who have kind of a working class sensibility, which I think is a very acute notion that this could all end, and the precariousness of it, and that someone else is in control. Whereas I think a middle class view of the world is oblivious to that, and like it's like I have this weird faith. Wonderful, but weird faith that I am in control and everything's gonna be okay.
Yeah, things will be fine.
Yeah, and yet in Windsor, in unionized Windsor, for all these large jobs, which are kind of shrinking quite dramatically, the people made really good wages. My mom, when she finished at GM, I think she retired in 2007 or 8. She was making towards $30 an hour. Which is an incredibly good wage for a kind of rank and file, you don't need a degree or anything, job, and highly educated people who some of them are like sessional professors at the universities here, and highly skilled, super educated knowledge workers make so little money. I was having a conversation with a friend today about one of my colleagues who runs a magazine, an indie magazine, said he makes $30,000 a year. Yet he lives a big city life, cosmopolitan. You know, it's kind of like all the cool Sesame Street urbanism things. Yeah. And yet it's like, wow, you make $30,000 and no benefits and no pension, and yet you are a middle class person. So class is not about the numbers. It's so ephemeral, this book was the hardest thing I've had to write, because I'm writing about something that's ephemeral, and not about like kind of the facts. And that's where the autobiography surprisingly came in, because to understand it, I had to start writing about how I grew up and lived in Windsor, and then what I was experiencing in Toronto, and that shift between the two places.
They seem close in the grand scheme, but they're pretty far apart in the economic scheme.
Yeah, but also as you go out in Toronto, Toronto has 2.8, give or take, million people, 5 million people in the whole metropolitan area. It's a complex place, and there are vast parts of Toronto that are very much like Windsor. People who live precarious lives, it's a very working class kind of place, and kind of low wage jobs. But it's sort of off the map. The places that are all written about in Toronto and celebrated are these middle-class places, whether or not the people have middle-class incomes. The thing you mentioned about politicians and how we're all talked to as middle-class people. In the book, I mentioned last year, Obama made a speech where he's talking about the middle class, and he referred to middle-class people from the person sweeping up the factory floor to the CEO of that factory. you middle class, like middle class doesn't mean a thing anymore. Like the word,
Not an aristocrat? Like, what does that even mean in America?
you're not an aristocrat and you are not a pauper starving on the side, right? So like it's that's pretty much like the bulk of society, and it's so convenient for politicians to have everyone think that they're middle class because it's just so easy for them to talk to everybody, right? It's like, oh yeah, that guy's talking to me. But it has actual policy ramifications. So if we are all living in precarious, those of us in this weird subset of the middle class, or maybe it's half of the middle class or more, sadly, living actually in precarious ways, with wages that are kind of on the downward or not as upwards as we would hope, we kind of live in this illusion that okay, no, we're middle class. Whereas if we were spoken to as people who are in precarious employment and we actually own that, maybe we would object to that a little more vocally, and politicians would feel compelled to change that, and that would mean policy and bylaws or investment in different places depending on the politics of a place. So because there's no constituency for this kind of loose precarious class, it's just totally ignored by politicians.
It was fascinating reading these autobiographical segments of the book, because you talk about growing up in Windsor, where for a while there it seemed like the default was work in the industry that was already in Windsor. For me, it's hard to get my mind around getting a job in whatever industry happens to be in the town you're already in. There's a certain way in which it makes sense, but a certain way in which my mind would never have gone in that direction. Do you know what I mean? It becomes a little bit unfathomable. And as well, with the whole thing about, as we say, flights are our kids, but I do wonder, it's like, I don't feel any desire for, and in fact I feel almost an anti-desire for kids, a house, or a car, standard middle class accoutrement, but I do wonder, is that just unconsciously being conditioned by the economy that I can't afford these things and thus I feel like I don't want them? Or does it make me part of the problem for not wanting them, that I don't demand the economic conditions that could support those things? These anxieties, do they sound familiar?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a delivered anxiety, which motivates people to get these things, and how people are actually living now. There are often reports of studies that like younger millennial types are not into having a car anymore, right? They've just kind of lived in a world where they haven't expected. I am a Generation X person of the 70s, so that having a car is still a thing. I still have a car. It's old and rusty, but I have it. And the first thing I did when I turned 16 was go for a driver's test. Nice. But I think the coming from Windsor, coming from a town like that, was one of the best things. I always wanted to move away, which I now feel guilty about as a person that has moved away, prodigal son sort of thing. Sure. But the perspective that growing up in a one industry or a manufacturing kind of town gives you on a place like Toronto or any big city like Toronto is really amazing, because you kind of see how, if I lived in Toronto, if I stayed in Windsor, despite going to university and then continuing on to grad school, the job I would have got probably would have been in one of those industries, maybe in the white collar section of those industries, or not. There are many colleagues of mine, high school colleagues, and even those who got undergraduate degrees in Windsor, who went through the 3 or 4 years of university, who had part-time jobs at one of the auto factories, and then when they finished their degree, they were offered like a full-time job, and they still work at Chrysler, making minivans in Windsor. And this story repeated that there was these people I know who have way more talent than I do, and could have been like, they played in bands, and they were like these amazing people that I was kind of in awe of. But the lure of this stability and this well-paying job, or as they say in Windsor, a job with good money. That's good money. You can't give away a job with good money.
So it's kind of a trap in that way.
It's a huge trap, a safe trap, but these people had other potential, I think, to do things, and I think sometimes I get a sense, and I actually quite hesitant to talk about this because I haven't asked them about it, but I get a sense of regret about it, that they kind of know that their talents, the things they love doing, were a little bit thwarted, and they went to the safe job, the thing that people did in a place like Windsor. So that attraction to middle class things, if you're going for a house or the kids, and that image of the nuclear kind of post-war image of modern family image, or in a working class town of the safe, solid job, is a really hard force to push against.
Now, growing up in Windsor, what was Toronto to you? What was the image of Toronto in your mind?
Toronto was sort of like an Oz-like city. It was
City on the hill?
Yes, city up the road, right? Up the highway, 3.5 hours up the highway. And it was, it had skyscrapers and everything, but it was, I guess if you're an American, it probably is the equivalent of New York, in the sense that it's the media center and so much culture comes out of it. Like the national news shows will have like a panorama of the Toronto skyline, because that's where the news comes from, and it's where the money is. Not necessarily the political power, because the capital, like America, is in the place where the economic capital is not, but so much comes out of the place, and it's also the biggest place, and it's the place people tend to go to. And in my mind, Toronto was this exciting place of layers, and it felt like I could keep unpeeling layers, which is actually the lure of great cities, is that you could keep unpeeling the layers and keep discovering the place, either geographically because it's spatially big, or culturally finding new things, and there's always some exciting thing around the corner. So like Toronto had that population, it had the culture. This is where the culture came from. This is where so many artists lived, and yet it had also these things like subways and streetcars, and it had like this electric nervous system running underneath it. And I grew up sort of in the suburbs where I needed a car, and when my car broke down, because it was always an old beater, I would almost feel like I would suffocate when the car was dead, because there was no public transportation. And just a funny anecdote, just sort of like the first walk I took in Toronto. When I got to Toronto, I had no idea how freeing the feeling of not having a car is, even though I still have one.
Not needing a car.
But not needing a car. And having a car was like having this kind of half-ton purse or bag that you always had to deal with.
Couldn't bring it in with you.
Yeah, where am I going to put this? Where am I going to put this thing? And I get to Toronto, and I just have my bag, like my little satchel or whatever it is, or not. But I found inevitably you have to carry a satchel in a big city. Whereas in Windsor, I never carried a bag with me because my car was the bag. I left the books in the car. But here, I had to carry a thing, and suddenly I felt this lightness, magical lightness of not having this thing to lug around, even though it got me around, because I could walk places, I could jump on and off of transit, even though we complain about transit in Toronto and it needs some work, but still I can move around in a way that I couldn't move around before. So.
Those complaints about Toronto Transit, I've heard a few so far in the interviews I've recorded, and even in your books, in Stroll, you write about this idea that Toronto kind of didn't realize it would become the metropolis that it has, and its infrastructure, transit especially, hasn't caught up. Do you think that's how true do you think that is? Do you think it's the main thing people need to know before they come here, or is it just something that happens to be true here?
I think if you came here as a visitor, you might not notice it. I think you would probably notice a congested, active, exciting city, like every city is. But if you have to like live it every day and like kind of understand where like the bottlenecks are and the breakages are. But Toronto has grown so quickly over the last 40 years. And the great Canadian city was always in Montreal. And from the beginning, it was the city on the St. Lawrence River. It was our port. And if you walk around Montreal, it has this grandiosity and solidness that Toronto doesn't have, like heavy buildings, solid monuments and things.
Old things.
Yeah, and it's a gorgeous city. Like I go to Montreal and I'm kind of in awe for 3 days. I'm just going like, and I'm like, I wish Toronto had this. I wish Toronto had this. But Toronto just sort of happened by accident. And it was a happy accident for a number of reasons. Canadian immigration in the 50s, 60s, 70s really brought all sorts of new people into the city. That was a really boring place before, a boring waspy city. No offense to the wasps, but they kind of like shut the doors at 6 p.m. and it's like, okay. So there was a loosening up from immigration. There was a loosening up because of Quebec separation in the 70s, or the threat of Quebec separation. So a whole lot of capital, human and economic, came from Montreal to Toronto. There's so many people here whose parents, like people who are Gen X or later, whose parents were Montrealers, but they came to Toronto because they didn't, the instability of that. So Toronto really benefited from that. And then the waves of American immigration from Vietnam, draft dodgers, and otherwise. And so Toronto just exploded, and it's exploded in population, in its multiculturalism, as well as its just economic dominance over the country. And like there are so many cranes in Toronto that people here complain about the cranes and construction, but you just have to go to a city that doesn't have this,
yes.
and you shut up very quickly.
When that's gone, there's nothing else there.
Yeah, so it's like the city almost doesn't even know what it has. So it's grown so fast, and yet I think it still thinks of itself as a midwestern city, like Indianapolis maybe, where you can kind of. And I've actually never been to Indianapolis, so no apologies.
No, but I kind of want to see it.
Apologies, but mid-sized cities where you can kind of drive to where you're going and park in front of the place or nearby it, and then drive home.
Drunk.
Drunk, yes, which is a thing people do in automotive cities by necessity, which is terrible. But I think that's sort of in the DNA of Toronto still. That is, but that's not how the city is anymore. Like it is a dense, populated place, and yet people think they can get in their car and do that. So there isn't this universal acceptance that we are a subway, streetcar transit sort of people, and we see that playing out in politics right now in this mayoral election. How hard it is to even talk about transit. It's almost like talking. Like the difficulty we have in talking about transit in Toronto is like the difficulty we have in talking about abortion on a political level or something. Right. It gets that ridiculous, like polarized. And I think it's because we have not accepted fully, as a city, we are a grown-up big world city, and it's incredibly exciting to be here right now because we're going through these shifts, but it's like being a teenager, and it's awkward and gangly, and nobody loves you, and people are just leaving you alone, and you're grumpy all the time, and it's a fascinating thing, teenagehood, but you would never ever want to do it again, and you can only hang out with teenagers for so long because they're a bit smelly. And I think Toronto's that right now. And it's going to become, I think, and there's no wood to knock, but I think it's going to become a great adult because it has so much potential in so many different ways, but it needs to really figure it out and kind of just mostly accept its cityness in a really wide, across cultural, economic, socio, whatever ways.
A lot of what you say reminds me of Los Angeles, where I live. There's the same situation where Los Angeles was the whitest city in America before 1965. Now it is by far the least white city in America, the most diverse. Los Angeles only recently came to terms with the fact that it is a city, that needs city infrastructure. You know, as you say, the cityness, it's only recently come to terms with that as well. Now they're kind of on a game plan for it, but it took a long time, longer than I would have liked it to take. You, as well as I do, have a kind of obsession with Los Angeles. How did you develop that, being up here in Toronto?
Well, part of that is how much culture and images have come out of Los Angeles from films and whatever else. But like growing up staying up late watching Johnny Carson, and he would make references, geographic references. I don't ever think his geographic jokes, I think, are under acknowledged. He would make jokes about Burbank, about the Pacific Coast Highway, about Malibu, about actual LA places. So they started to live in my imagination. And then so many films, of course, have been made in Los Angeles. Things like from the Little Rascals in the 20s or 30s when they were filmed. And so you saw this old LA where you could still sometimes see orange groves, but you saw the hills in the background. You know, so you had like 70, 80 years of Los Angeles imagery driven into you. And then things like news helicopters. I think Los Angeles was one of the first cities to really embrace the news helicopter
and to do the police helicopter.
Yeah, in the late 80s, there's Blue Thunder, that movie from '83, which was about a police helicopter, and then a brief TV series, if I remember, that was canceled too soon, because you got all these great aerial shots of LA. So, but there were always shots of high-speed car chases on the Hollywood freeway or whatever else, and so you had this knowledge of Los Angeles topography, and you have never been there. And so when I went to Los Angeles for the first time in 2001, it was the most intense feeling of deja vu I've ever felt, and I may be using that a bit liberally, deja vu, but it's like, I have been here before. I know this place. I know this geography. Oh, look, it's Beverly Boulevard. I know this place, but I've never been here before. It's the Beverly Center. Look, it's Cedars-Sinai Hospital. Sure. Oh, that's where all the stars go when they
right next to each other conveniently.
Yeah, and that's where all the stars go when they OD, right? Because you've seen so many shots of reporters standing in front of that place. Right. So LA lives in the imagination. But then when I get to Toronto I think has this idea of itself as being a small town, of being a city of neighborhoods. That's what its reputation is. And there's some very cute downtown neighborhoods of Victorian homes that are very, it's almost San Franciscan-like, without the hills. We have the ravines here. But so much of Toronto expanded in the post-war era, just like LA. So you get out of the downtown core, and it's a Los Angeles landscape. We have, the 401, Highway 401, which is our multi-lane express highway that runs across east-west across the top of Toronto, is the busiest highway in North America, or the world, but I think North America for sure. And it has bumped in and out a freeway, which I think is it the Santa Ana?
That's one of them. I don't know what the stats are.
One of the LA freeways is the busiest in America, and our 401 has bumped out the LA as the busiest, per hour cars that go by. So it's a Los Angeles landscape. So the more I paid attention to Los Angeles and Los Angeles writing, and then after I went there, I was like, LA is very analogous to Toronto, Toronto's sprawly majority, really, without the palm trees, sadly.
Yes, those are distinctive to it. I mean, talking about the landscape, we recently on the show, listeners will have heard Denise Balkassoon specifically name you as somebody who would disagree with her when she said she thought Toronto was not an attractive landscape. People say it about Los Angeles too, but both cities have their defenders. Both cities have a lot of people who call them ugly, even residents. Why is that? Why does Toronto have that contingent of people who insist it's ugly?
Because it's kind of ugly.
Sure.
Toronto.
You said you would disagree, so.
Toronto is not a traditionally beautiful city, but I think the beauty is in is in its ugliness. And by ugly, I mean its heterogeneity.
Sure.
There is no Toronto look. Toronto writers, Toronto architecture, urban enthusiasts have often struggled and wondered about what is the Toronto look. And is it Victorian homes? You know, some of these celebrated downtown neighborhoods. But no, it's not, because that's a very small part of Toronto, and it's this kind of messy urbanism that we have in Toronto. And actually, it was a Los Angeles urbanist named James Rojas, who was here for a Walk 21 conference, which is this international conference about walking and walkability. And he was here, I think, in 2008, and we met at this conference. And he's a Latino, Angelino, writes a lot about Latino urbanism, but is based in Los Angeles. And he said Toronto has messy urbanism. So it's his phrase. But I think, having gone to LA, I'm kind of reminded of Toronto, in that there's you can kind of expect everything. I think that's why LA and Toronto both have film industries. You know, this place is called Hollywood North, because Toronto and Los Angeles can play anywhere. You can find a street in Toronto that can be Chicago or New York or even some European streets, and I think the same in LA. But that doesn't give anybody a hook to easily, explain their city, right? Toronto it's taken me now 3 minutes to explain this. It's insufferable. So it's complex, and it's all messed up. But I think the heterogeneity of our architecture, that look, that a little bit ugly look, that it just sort of happened accidentally, might, and this is a theory, that might correlate with why we are such a multicultural city, in that, like, people from all over the place have flocked here, and sort of been able to make their way here. Not perfectly, and we're dealing with some real problems with that, but we still kind of strive for that ideal of being like this kind of multicultural, happy place. And I think it's because it's been so kind of the actual physical landscape of Toronto is so mixed up. It's not, there's no narrative that is laid down on the city. The way when you go to Paris, it's so Parisian and beautiful. It is the archetype of a beautiful city. Or if you go to Prague, or if you go to Edinburgh, and it's like the story is quite literally written in stone of that city. And Toronto, it's not. And I think in LA, and that's why I'm attracted to Los Angeles, the story is not written in stone. The people who live there now are inventing it. And we're in an election year in Toronto, and it's ugly sometimes, it's too ugly, and it's depressing, but it's exciting at the same time, because there's all these forces and people and constituencies vying for their place on the idea of Toronto. And whereas if you move to, when I was working on a project, an art project in Edinburgh, so I got to live there for a few weeks, a few times, so I really kind of got to know it, and artists who, like bands, kind of indie bands and whatever, and other artists kept repeating this sentiment that it's really hard to do something new in Edinburgh. And I've heard this from Parisian people of the same sort, in that the idea of Paris was set. Like, all the literature keeps referring to, Simone de Beauvoir and everything else that happened before, because it's so archetypal. Whereas our cities, these newer cities, surprising new cities, that stuff hasn't been written as much, which gives us a bit of nervousness as citizens, because we don't have that foundation of mythology, or we don't think we do, even though there has been writing in both of our cities about the place. But it gives us a lot of liberty to kind of feel like we get to actually do something here.
Right. There's not that burden of legacy, it's true, even though I've read much interesting Los Angeles writing and much interesting Toronto writing now, much of it by you. In fact, how long did it take before you knew you would be writing about Toronto?
Well, it took me a while to actually consider myself a writer. I think it was probably, and this is a terrible thing, it was probably when I got paid.
That's a good thing. You don't want to struggle too long in the trenches with no money at all.
Yeah, but it was weird. It kind of clicked in because we're still an income-based people. But when I got here and I didn't have any other outlet, and blogs had not been invented, the internet was around, of course, in 2000, but I would start sending emails back, like CC all friends. So there'd be like 30 or 40 or 50 people on these emails of my Toronto day. And I would talk about the walk I did, walking down Yonge Street, our main street in Toronto, and things I encountered. And I would just like send it to people. And I think some people were extremely annoyed that I was sending them this, but it was like I felt this urge to report on the city I was seeing here in Toronto. And then that kind of trickled into writing for websites that at the time didn't pay, probably still don't pay, and then it became writing for local weeklies, arts weeklies, and then writing for newspapers and the magazine we do, Spacing Magazine. I found some people who have this fascination about Toronto, and we started the magazine 10 years ago, and so it's almost like, in hindsight, I can see it, but at the time I was just like, I really loved this place, and I was confounded by it, but I also loved it, and my way of expressing it was writing about it, and so it just kind of morphed into a career. I knew my ideal would be to be a writer, but that seemed I think because I was from Windsor, and
nobody was a writer there.
No, and I needed a practical job that paid money.
And putting labels on beer bottles.
Exactly. And so I think I kind of stumbled into it by following the kind of passion I had for the place, which I have no idea where that urge or that kind of tenacity came from.
Right. It's the same with me in Los Angeles, though. I think you hit on something you felt confounded by it. Los Angeles, I know, is essentially unmasterable, yet the challenge of trying to do that is almost irresistible to me. Is it the same for you in Toronto?
I think so, but you really want to master it.
You want to? I know I can't, but I know I want to try.
When did you realize that it was unmasterable and you were just like whacking? This is how I look at it. You're whacking a stick at the beast.
Yes, I think I went into it knowing that, and that was part of the appeal. Like, no one's ever going to fully know this place. It changes too fast and it's too amorphous. But that itself was an appeal. Like, that challenge, you can become a sort of weathered New Yorker over time, or a San Franciscan who's seen it all, but no one ever really, no matter how long they're there, how hard they work, fully grasps Los Angeles. Is it the same feel about Toronto?
Yeah, absolutely. Like there's no Toronto identity of the kind of owning Toronto. Toronto people do not own their Toronto-ness. They almost like shrug it off and are a little embarrassed about being from Toronto. And Torontonians are not in love with their city. Though if you nudge them into it, which I try to do in writing, they come around to saying, no, I love that, and I love that. No, maybe I actually do like the place, but they have to be like, really, like their ass has to be kicked in that direction. Whereas like, you go to New York, and New Yorkers are just like, I am a New Yorker, and like
live anywhere else.
Yeah, and like
call this a bagel.
Yeah, and like F you, like I don't give a shit. I am a New Yorker, and I think maybe Londoners have that a little bit. It's expressed differently.
They're big on complaining, though, as a rule.
Yes, but this city, it's just so interesting, and I think being an outsider, which now I'm deeply an insider, but I think still having that kind of history of coming from outwards, and I still carry that perspective with me that this is kind of an awesome place, and like, holy cow, embrace this, like just own it. And Torontonians are occupied sometimes by this thing where the rest of Canada, our relationship with the rest of Canada, doesn't like us. You know, there was a book published in 1954 called "Let's All Hate Toronto," and there was in 54, like they were ahead of the curve, because it should have been "Everyone Hates Montreal," because they were the big Kahuna, whatever Kahuna is. But there was a documentary made maybe in the late 2008 or so called "Why Does Everyone Hate Toronto?" And it's this weird antipathy you get when you go around and you just hear people like running down Toronto, or Torontonians expecting people to run down Toronto. And I think we shouldn't give a shit anymore. I think we should just say, no, sorry, this is Toronto. And that doesn't mean you suck. That doesn't mean smaller cities are bad. It's just like, this is what this is. And we are going to accept that we are this crazy, wonderful metropolis that's complex and messy, and is exploding in different ways, and is like an onion with the layers. And we don't have to kind of apologize about that anymore. But we still like the hinterland and smaller places. So, but it's the same relationship New York has with the rest of America, and the way London has with like the rest of England and the north of England, in that these cities almost become, because there's so much going on in them, they become a little bit like they're criticized for being, solipsistic and self-absorbed, but there is a lot of stuff going on around you, and there's millions of people around you. So it's not because you don't care about the people around in farther away. It's just that it takes a little more work to see it. And I think from the outside, which I understand, coming from the outside, you get a little bit bummed out about it.
It's true. I mean, I take it there's another way in which it's like Los Angeles, that when you came here and after you'd started writing, nobody who was born in Toronto, said, you can't write about Toronto, you haven't been here long enough. No one treats you as a Johnny-come-lately here, right?
I have never got that. I am a white male saying this, so take this with whatever grain of salt that comes with. I think you are a Torontonian when you get here and you decide you like it here, and you get to belong to the city, and you get to contribute to the city, or at least ideally, that's what I would like to. That's the Toronto I would like to fight for, that everyone could experience. I think what I experienced, because I was fascinated with the place, and I started writing about it, and I never once heard that kind of thing. Whereas you go to small towns, like my mother is from small town Nova Scotia, and the come from a ways, the people who have come from elsewhere in 1950, or their parents came from somewhere else and moved to the small fishing village. They still sort of have this. They're not actually from here. Whereas you were Toronto, because it doesn't have, I think, the heaviness of the history, even though we do have quite an interesting history. But it's not so heavy that it doesn't push other people out. And sometimes I wonder, like, I write about Toronto and try to mix the history with what's now, with actually in the contemporary city, and I wonder if I'm trying to establish a more robust culture and history of the city in my small way. Is that actually making it harder for future people to come here? So that is a worry, but whatever. So maybe actually, it's to your point of like accepting that it's the city that you can't get your head around. Maybe that's actually a really good state to be in. Maybe Los Angeles and Toronto being these flailing cities that are teenager, awkward, figuring themselves out. Maybe that's the best time to be in a city, because it is the time when whoever you are, you do have the maximum amount of liberty to do something, to make your mark, to form it.
Now, did you know when you started writing about Toronto you could one day produce a 350 plus page book of psychogeographic walking tours?
No, I did not. But I sometimes think the book was a 10-year project, even though, as books go, you end up jamming it out in the last 4 months in a horrible horrible state where you
long rush, yes.
where you should never have any friends because you abuse them and like are grumpy. But that's a minor author. That's a problem with the author, and if we had unions, we would have a way to deal with that. The person would be taken away to a retreat,
mandatory writers' retreat,
away from hurting their friends. But exploring the city, writing about it in weird ways. There were those early emails I sent in 2001, and Stroll, the walking book, was published in 2010. There's bits of those emails that made their way into the book. So it was a constant compiling of information. And when I started writing for newspapers and the Alt Weekly here in Toronto, there's word constraints because of print media, and yet I would have this huge amount of research and geographic research and archival research and otherwise. And so the book allowed me to really just blow up those kind of smaller pieces. So the nuggets were always being formed in one way or the other, and then writing a book kind of blew it up. But if I was to think about it from the beginning, it was probably, and I'm very lucky in that if I could have ever done something, had an idea of what I would do, would be to write a book about the city that I had always pined away for and wished I lived in. And then I actually did it. So I need to kind of kick myself once in a while. And that I'm actually quite lucky that I was able to do this. And people have read it and that sort of thing.
As we say, your most recent book, The Trouble with Brunch, is not directly about Toronto, but would you say you have more Toronto books in you, more directly Toronto-focused books?
I do. I'm actually currently writing a book about this Toronto election. And it's not done yet, but this has been a very interesting election because we've had this mayor, Rob Ford, who has put Toronto on the map. And wherever you go as a Torontonian now, you don't have to tell people what Toronto is. Like, you say you're from Toronto, and before 2012 or so, when you became an international celebrity, we would more often than not have to say a little bit more about what Toronto is, despite its size and despite having the Toronto International Film Festival and these things. Film people knew, but you still had to kind of remind people what Toronto is. You don't have to do that anymore.
They have a mental image, and it's a slovenly crackhead.
Yes, but also a tragic character, right? Yes. Like he's now suffering from cancer, and when you're here in Toronto, it's really difficult because this mayor is a horrible mayor, and he said racist things, he's said incredibly homophobic things and misogynistic things.
It wouldn't be plausible, as I said in an interview earlier, as a fictional character. You'd have to tone him down, but he's real.
No, it would be a rejected screenplay, and even what happened. We are now. It is late September as we are sitting here talking. A few weeks ago, he was diagnosed with cancer, and it's like this is 5-6 weeks before the election that would have definitively pushed him out. That we were waiting for as Torontonians to say, no, we're not this, and yet we've had that taken away from us because he's now sick, and he's a sick man, and we feel bad for him. Like despite the horrible things he's done, he doesn't deserve this, and he has kids and everything else. So he's the most confounding, diabolical, interesting political character to follow. So this election is an incredible thing to write about, and I'm using the book to write about Toronto now, about it, as I mentioned earlier, being this teenage city about to come to, I hope, to terms with itself. So I'm using the book to write about some of those Los Angeles kind of places outside of the sexy center, the sprawling parts, which this mayor, Rob Ford, has found a constituency because they've been left out of the narrative of Toronto. So if there's any good that this mayor has done, despite the bad things he's done, he's kicked us in the head, almost literally, and reminded us that there's this huge population of people that have been left out of the kind of exciting Toronto story that we've been experiencing over the last decade and a bit.
So no matter how bad Rob Ford's conduct, you can explain why he's mayor by his appeal to the forgotten Toronto, shall we say, or the Toronto that feels forgotten, which is this outer Toronto, one only kind of recently incorporated, right, in the 90s?
Yeah, Toronto was amalgamated in 1998. It was a decentralized city where it had a metropolitan government for the larger area of 6 boroughs, but there was still the core of Toronto, downtown Toronto, which was largely center leftish, in somewhat more conservative suburbs. Though those are large generalizations, it's much more complex than that when you actually look at how people vote. And in 1998, it was amalgamated into one government, rather than a decentralized government. So from almost it became like a federal state or something like that. It is now the 4th biggest metropolis or municipal government in the United States, in North America, because we passed Chicago last year, just in terms of population under one, say, mayor. So it's an incredibly big thing, and we now have spent more than 15, 16 years reconciling these places that were sort of autonomous from each other, yet I think need each other, because this kind of core of Toronto, the old city of Toronto, is an incredibly expensive place to live, and there's been a Manhattanization here, and the people that can live here are very it comes down to, again, a class thing. It's a middle class, upper middle class kind of place, the place that can afford the high rents and whatever downtown, which makes it really kind of homogenous, and at the risks becoming a very boring kind of corporatized Starbucks on every corner, even though I go to Starbucks kind of place, and there is actually, I'm looking around, Starbucks on every corner here. Whereas the suburbs are kind of where the exciting stuff is happening. That's where the actual multiculturalism happens that we as Torontonians embody, even though
the Toronto story, multiculturalism.
But it happens in the suburbs because it's a little cheaper, and some of the economic excitement is out there. We have strip malls, which, again, to your point earlier about Toronto being ugly, we have strip malls in these suburbs, a huge amount of them, but I think they're the most interesting places in Toronto because...
Right. Arguably in Los Angeles, too.
Yeah, because the rent is low enough that people can... mom and pops, for lack of a better word, can start a business. Whereas downtown, the overhead is too high, the rent is too high, because only the chains can come in, or somebody that has the money to do it. But out there, you can scramble together a little bit of money and start a roti shop, or you can start like a juice shop or a barber shop or whatever it is. If you were to remove the parking lot in front of all these strip malls in Toronto, just Google image search Toronto strip mall, and you'll find the most beautiful array of signage in every different language. It's colorful and it's heterogeneous and mixed up. But I think it's just it is the Toronto image that I think we strive for. And if you were to remove that parking lot in front of it and drag those strip malls to the street, it would be the quintessential perfect urban kind of landscape, right?
I have the same fantasy about Los Angeles. Just get it to where the trains can get there, and then we're good.
Yeah, so it's like the car got in the way of things in some way, because of the way we design for cars. So it's a design thing. It's not a people thing. So the cultures that are out there are the most interesting in Toronto, and yet they've been kind of dismissed by the political classes, which are often focused downtown, and media classes that are downtown. So Rob Ford, in his awkward way, was a kick in the ass for a lot of people, and myself included, that these places exist and have been left out, and we've taken them for granted, and they need the amount of attention that a place and that downtown has got. And Rob Ford is a classic populist and appeals in that way as an everyman, despite himself being a millionaire from a millionaire family. But that doesn't even register that he's actually a millionaire. He talks like a regular guy, and he has problems like a regular guy.
Worse, I would say, than a regular guy.
A little worse. Some of us might drink too much, but we smoke less crack.
Right. And not in drunken stupors, as he says.
Yes, and we're not in the mayor in that. But so he he appeals to people in so many different ways, and also reminds us in different ways of this. So I think it's a lot of work for people who might be progressive or leftists or centerists or just urbanists to figure out a way to communicate to people that they, number one, they matter, and they're not like some other thing. They are us, and to figure out how to bring them into the city, the way people who live downtown embrace the city and the power of the city and that sort of thing.
Finally, what is something walking has taught you, or what is something that walking has made you or allowed you to understand about Toronto? Something that you understand now in a way that you wouldn't have had you not walked, had you spent all the time on the subway instead, or driving, or cycling even?
Well, I think this gets back to the beginning of our conversation, and the distance and details is the other part of it. But when you were moving in a vehicle, and this even applies to a bike in a certain sense, a little bit less, but when you were walking, the city is intimate. You have an intimate relationship with the city, and everything else is a little bit too fast. Rebecca Solnit, who's a great San Franciscan writer, who is one of my favorite writers, and she wrote a book in 2000 called Wanderlust, which when I discovered it, it became my Bible of walking, because like, oh my God, someone else likes walking. And it was like when you don't know how to articulate the thing you love, and then someone else comes along and either makes an art object or writes a book and explains to you about, and so there's connection, and in this book, Solnit writes, cities move at the speed of walking, which I think she says is 3 miles per hour, and it's at that speed that you can overhear conversations and you can smell things like bakeries or sewer stinks or whatever it is, or BO on the subway.
Things you want, things you don't want.
Yeah, but it's reportage of the city, whether you're a reporter or not, and you're hearing it and you're feeling it and smelling it with all your senses, and other things are a little bit too fast. So the walking has given me the idea that I can actually cross the city on my own power, but more importantly, given me a window into all the details of the city that otherwise I missed. And it's actually funny going back to Windsor, hometown, and I lived there for 25 years, a city that I thought I knew like the back of my hand intimately, because I had a relationship with most neighborhoods because there was a party there, or my grandmother lived there. But when I go back now, I realize that I knew it from a car, and I don't actually know it. So it's been this kind of quiet personal project to kind of walk around Windsor, different parts. The parts I flew by for decades.
You knew where you drove to and drove from. That's it.
But the stuff in between I thought I knew, but I didn't know. So I've tried to go for walks over the last while to reacquaint myself. So walking, it's the intimacy and the humanity of a city really comes out through a place. And some of my best walks, when I visit a lot of cities, and some of my favorite walks, I've been walking around Los Angeles, because it's shown me in LA that nobody really, I mean, now there are writers that get it, and I search them out, but it's not part of like kind of the popular image of LA, and so I kind of have become an LA like advocate, because I've walked around LA and seen the kind of densities and layers that it's happened, which you would never notice if you were in your car. And most people go to LA and rent a car.
I've been speaking here in Toronto in Church-Wellesley Village. Is this, what neighborhood are we in?
Sometimes called Church-Wellesley. It's sometimes called the Gayborhood. It's sometimes called Upper Jarvis. We are a city of neighborhoods that are in conflict with each other in naming rights.
Like Los Angeles. I've been speaking in one of those neighborhoods here in Toronto, Canada, with Shawn Micallef. He is the author of many things. He's a Toronto Star columnist. He is the author of the book Stroll, Psychogeographic Walking Tours of Toronto. Most recently, The Trouble with Brunch. He's also the man behind various other urban projects. Shawn, thanks so much.
Thank you, Colin.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kadlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Treher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, John Wolfe, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.